Well, here's where we left off in the last video. The frame with a new parallel bar footrest base and the normal but poorly designed fork with an upper and lower triple tree. Well, new problems arose from the previous fork design and the design changes of the footrest. Primarily, the footrest had to be designed to splay outward significantly to fit the turning of the parallel bars of the fork. After some deliberation, I decided to alter the fork design. After many iterations, this is what I settled on. This is a significant deviation from standard motorcycle forks, which have a simple upper and lower tree connecting the two main structural parallel beams that go down to the wheels. Instead, the upper and lower tree equivalents are both moved to below the steering column, and the column itself is beefed up, and a parallel bar added to the column for extra rigidity. I took care to make this fork mostly out of the existing parts of the fork, so only minimal extra work would be needed. I also ran this through SOLIDWORKS' finite element analysis program, checking for twisting moments, bending moments, and lateral flexing. First of all, to make room for the lower steering bar, the steering column had to be slightly modified. The notches at the top center of this image and the center are what was cut out. This allowed the parallel bar to turn 45 degrees and also created a nice steering lock, preventing it from turning any further. And here are all the pieces for the new fork tree, lined up and ready for welding. And the completed fork now attached to the steering column. The handlebars are a quick and easy job. And now the front tire, its split rim, and the spindle mount were all fabricated. And all these pieces were fit tested before I made the new fork, and it was looking pretty good. And here again is the virtual pivot point assembly, though I've added some gas shocks to help it rise up, and some solenoid retractable hooks to lock it down. I felt that the bars that made up the virtual pivot assembly enabled too much lateral flexibility. They were made from 1" by 1/4" cold rolled steel, so I doubled them up and added real thrust bearings. Note the frame mount was also doubled up. The whole virtual pivot point assembly is doubled up. This definitely improves lateral stiffness, however I still wasn't satisfied. Around this time I changed my mind about the front end. Originally the whole steering column would rise up with a virtual rotation point around the spindle or front axle, so raising this up wouldn't require lowering or lifting the bike at all. There's a big issue with this though, and that's getting that steering column to lock down tight when lowered, getting it completely rigid. It's difficult with my equipment to get it locked down and stiff enough. It needs to be as rigid as if it were welded together. You don't want any flex between your steering input and your steering response. It's very dangerous. So I decided to separate the handlebars from the steering column. Now only the handlebars would rise up around the virtual pivot point, but the steering column would stay put. Seems kind of obvious in hindsight. The only change would be a separate assembly for the handlebars and some kind of mechanism to lock the handlebars to the steering column when they are lowered. That's a much easier challenge to overcome than making sure the steering column itself is rigidly attached to the frame. Here's a picture of the old design with the steering column rising up with the virtual pivot point assembly. And here's the new design. The virtual pivot point bars are fully extended here out to the left. But note the steering column housing is still in the same place attached to the frame, rigid and not moving. In this picture though, the steering column itself is a single solid bar extending up to the handlebars. So here the handlebars can't rise up. This was just to ensure alignment. The virtual pivot point assembly is opened and extended all the way out of the way to the left, and will get the handlebars attached to it. This actually required only adding 2 pairs of 1" by 1" steel tubes, pictured in red here, as the outer width of the column housing in blue happened to be exactly 2 inches narrower than the inner width of the upper body of the frame. So the steering column needs to be separated into 2 steering columns and 2 housings. The main steering column and housing supports the fork and is attached to the frame. Here is the mini floating steering column. This will hold only the handlebars and a locking mechanism and be mounted to the virtual pivot point assembly. When it's closed, this will lock with the main steering column. Using a sleeve here to line them up, you can now see exactly where that mini steering column will go. The arms of the virtual pivot point assembly are on either side of it. Around this time, I upgraded my 1980 Honda XL250 to a Kawasaki KLX 500. I started on that small Honda and progressively increased the size of the bikes I'm riding. This is the safest way to learn to ride, aside from growing up doing constant off-road riding. I'd been making great progress so far, but around this time the first bad luck storm hit. I was laid off from my nice IT job, big cutbacks at my employer, which was the main IT employer in the area. I had to downsize, regroup, lost my house and garage shop. I moved in with my brother, rented a small shop, but didn't have a lot of money left over to actually buy things and work on the project. Amazingly, I was able to fit my disassembled bike into the back of my Subaru. Nice. A dozen trips later and I moved into the new shop. It was about 20 feet by 20 feet. So here was the current progress of the assembled bike with me on it in the new shop. It was looking pretty good, but progress would slow to a crawl for some time. These two bars were added in front of the engine for additional triangulation and strength. I needed to fabricate some specific aluminum parts, which are quite costly to have custom made. So after some research, I decided to make my parts out of a lost foam casting method of aluminum. After some small experimentation, I started on building a kiln for melting that aluminum. I wanted a lightweight, yet thermally insulative kiln, and I recalled how the Romans used pumice in the concrete of the ceiling of the Pantheon and thought that was a great idea. So I filled the base and sides of the kiln with lava rocks and poured in concrete. The kiln, as you can see, is just a basic construction of an inner and outer hexagon with pumice in between. Here's a pic from my first test pour. How cool is that? Propane burns hot enough to melt aluminum, but not hot enough to melt steel. So you can make your kiln, your crucible, etc. out of steel. I'll do a video on the aluminum casting process later. These aren't going to be lab pure alloys or anything that you can use in aerospace or anything like that. The exhaust gases from the kiln and the steel will introduce impurities into the casting. But planing around that reduced strength and stiffness is not difficult. And most of this is going to be over-engineered. But all of this is going to be much less expensive, really by an order of magnitude or two, than having individual parts custom made at CNC prototyping shops. I built a couple of these handy durable benches for the new shop, which was bigger than my old 1.5 car garage shop. I fabricated a metal rack, which is basically just two metal A's, each about 3 feet tall, with support sticking out to organize my growing metal clutter. I also purchased that nice grizzly bandsaw you see there. I started on the front wheel components as well. The brake rotors and calipers are original from the CX500. The metal bracket is part of the front end, and this will be a leading link front end with anti-dive. But that's a topic that deserves a video of its own, so keep an eye out for that. And my next motorcycle upgrade was to a Kawasaki KLR 650. This big single cylinder thumper is a reliable workhorse with a great reputation. Well, that's it for part 2. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. Please hit that like button. Please subscribe. I'm trying to hit that 1,000 subscriber milestone, so I'd really appreciate it if you can do that. And see you next time. Thanks.